Hi Guy, welcome back TV Spoilers. Young and the Restless revealed that Sally hadn't planned to say it yet. But some truths sit in your chest like a stone no matter how tightly you hold them down. They only grow heavier. Ever since Kane's offer of the Chancellor position surfaced like a velvet-wrapped trap, everything around Billy had become sharper, more fragile, more explosive. He was already standing at the edge of two opposing forces, on one side. The hunger to reclaim what he once lost, on the other. The fear of being used again by people who always knew exactly where to press. Billy didn't want anyone interfering, especially not when it came to choices that would define him in Genoa City's ruthless spotlight. He refused to be seen as desperate, refused to be painted as a man grabbing for power just to prove he still mattered. But the silence he'd been hiding behind, the way he dodged questions, the sudden flashes of temper that seemed to come from nowhere, those things only amplified Sally's unease. She knew him too well for her own comfort. And that understanding was both her greatest strength and the most dangerous crack in their relationship. When Sally finally admitted that she had tried to contact Jill about Kane's offer, Billy's face darkened almost instantly. It wasn't just irritation at being overstepped. It was the raw feeling of someone crossing a border he had been guarding with his life. Billy had always treated anything involving Jill as sacred ground, of the last places where he could still choose how to be a son, how to be an abbot, how to stand as a grown man who owned his decisions. Sally touching that space without asking made him feel reduced. Like a child who needed someone to handle things for him, or worse. Like a pawn being adjusted into position. His anger didn't erupt into shouting. It rose like heat trapped under the skin, turning everything in him rigid and sharp. Sharpening his defenses until even love felt like pressure. Sally didn't deny it. She had stepped in. But she hadn't done it out of curiosity or control. What she'd been seeing in Billy lately was a man walking straight into Kane's snare while insisting he was the one holding the strings. She could feel the dangerous pull the Chancellor role had on him. It wasn't just a title. It was a weapon. It was proof. It was the chance to force everyone, including himself, to look at him differently. And that was exactly why Sally was afraid. Afraid that Billy would run into another war, lose his footing, and end up paying with everything that mattered. She'd watched Genoa City chew people up for believing they could dance with power and walk away clean. She didn't want Billy's name to become the next cautionary tale. But Billy couldn't hear her fear the way she meant it, because inside him, the fear of being controlled was louder. Kane might be dangerous. Victor might be the shadow behind everything. Yet Billy still needed to believe that his choices were his, at least that. The more Sally pushed, the more he felt cornered, and the more his reactions turned into resentment. He began to see her as someone inserting herself too deeply into his private life, acting like she had the right to redraw his boundaries without consent. His anger wasn't fair, but it was real, fed by years of being judged by family, warned by Jack, played by Victor, and left to carry the weight of his failures alone. Billy didn't want another person standing beside him with that quiet look that said, "I know what's best for you." Sally watched him and realized she was standing on a razor-thin line between love and possession. She loved him enough to worry, enough to act, but acting might be the very thing that pushed him away. And then, right as Billy seemed ready to slam an emotional door shut for good, Sally had to use the truth she'd been holding back as a last resort. She didn't need to raise her voice. The information itself was heavy enough to change the air in the room. Jill's condition was critical, not a passing fatigue, not something that could be put off for a few busy days. Critical in a way that made time feel like a predator. Billy's anger was yanked out from under him. All the pride, all the defensiveness, all the fear collapsed like a coat falling off his shoulders. What was left was shock so cold it ran through his spine. He hadn't known. Or maybe he'd refused to know, because deep down Billy had always believed Jill was unbreakable. Jill was sharp. Jill was relentless. Jill was the kind of woman who survived storms and then criticized the sky for not trying harder. Billy was used to her being the one who judged him, cut him down with brutal honesty, and still somehow anchored him at the same time. One word, critical, was enough to destroy that image and leave him facing something he couldn't fix. For a moment, he didn't even know how to react. Part of him wanted to explode at Sally for keeping this from him. But another part wanted to cling to her because she was the only person brave enough to drag him back into reality. He wanted to run to Jill immediately. Yet guilt locked his feet to the floor. Guilt that he'd been so consumed by Kane, by that title, by the thrill of a power play, that he hadn't noticed the most important person in his life slipping away. The pain didn't show up as tears. It showed up as pressure in his throat, a crushing ache that made it hard to breathe. A chaos that scrambled his thoughts until he hated himself for being weak in front of Sally. Sally understood in that instant that she had broken a wall, but what lived behind the wall wasn't peace. It was a storm. She didn't want to use Jill's health as leverage over Billy, but the truth was, it would change everything whether she intended it or not. Kane's offer arriving at the same time Jill was in danger no longer felt like coincidence. To Sally, it looked like a blade hidden inside a gift box, aimed straight at Billy's softest point. And the most terrifying part was that Billy was starting to see it too. But he wasn't getting calmer, he was splitting in half. One side of him wanted to charge into battle to prove he was still powerful. The other side wanted to drop everything and run to Jill, like a son who still needed one final moment of recognition. The tension between Sally and Billy was no longer just about whether she was interfering. It became something deeper and darker, who Billy would choose to be. When everything began to collapse, Sally didn't want to lose him to the addiction of power disguised as purpose. But she also didn't want to become the reason he lost Jill in the most irreversible way. Billy, meanwhile, began to see Sally not just as his partner, but as a mirror that reflected the messy truth inside him. She understood him too clearly, and that clarity both saved him and exposed him until he felt stripped bare. The air between them thickened as if one wrong sentence could shatter everything. Billy didn't thank her. He didn't apologize for the anger. He just stood there, face tight with the effort of swallowing too many emotions at once. Then he turned away, not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't bear to collapse where Sally could see it. Yet even in silence, Sally could hear the sound of him breaking, the kind of breaking Billy always tried to hide behind. Reckless decisions, sharp words, and that stubborn refusal to admit he was scared. When Billy finally found his voice, what came out wasn't softness. It was a cold question packed with panic. He demanded to know where Jill was, who told Sally, and most of all how much time they had left. Sally didn't drown him in medical details. She only said Jill was weaker than the version Billy still carried in his mind. And the truth didn't wait for anyone to feel ready. She told him she'd reached out because she was terrified. He was about to make the biggest decision of his life while the person who mattered most might not even be strong enough to witness him becoming the man he kept promising he could be. Those words cut deeper than Billy expected, because they landed directly on his most private fear that he would fail again, and this time, he would fail at the exact moment he could never rewrite. Jill might be gone before he could say one meaningful sentence. Before he could prove he was more than the family disaster. Everyone laughed about behind closed doors. And while that terror wrapped around his heart, Kane was still somewhere out there, waiting for Billy to step into the trap like a man desperate to escape pain by chasing adrenaline. Sally knew that the moment she spoke this truth, their relationship stepped into dangerous territory. If Billy chose to shut down and blame her, they could break. If Billy chose to face it, they could still break because what came next might be too heavy for love to carry. But she said it anyway because she would rather be hated than let Billy drown in regret. She didn't grab his hand. She didn't beg for comfort. She simply stood still and waited, letting Billy find his way through the storm in his own way. Billy finally left, carrying an anger that had transformed into fear. He didn't even know where he was going first, toward Jill, toward Kane, or toward some dark corner where he could breathe again. But one thing was certain, the Chancellor role was no longer just ambition. It had become tied to life and death, family and guilt, choices that could never be undone. And as Billy stepped out the door, his phone buzzed like fate, snapping its fingers an unknown number. A single message that froze his blood in his veins. Jill had been rushed into emergency care, and Kane was already there. Jill has always been the kind of woman who can make all of Genoa City hold its breath, without even saying a word. She doesn't need to appear often to prove her power, because the name Jill itself carries weight and invisible pressure hanging over every decision the Abbott family makes. That's why, when news of Jill's health crisis begins to spread, the first emotion isn't confusion so much as a sudden free-fall uncertainty. People realize that even the symbols they thought could never crack can fracture in a single moment. And that fracture cuts straight into Billy's inner world. Because no one carries more layered emotion for Jill than Billy does. For him, Jill isn't just family. She's history. She's pressure. She's cold judgment. She's every moment he tried to rise and felt himself dragged back down. She's the wound in his pretty and also the toxic fuel that keeps pushing him to prove he deserves a place at the table. Some relationships are so complicated that you can't name them with love alone or anger alone. Jill and Billy have always been that kind of bond. They have too many reasons to blame each other, but also too many invisible threads tying them together. The kind of threads that tighten the harder you struggle. Billy has spent much of his life feeling like he had to earn Jill's approval, and when he couldn't, he turned that need into reckless behavior, into self-sabotage, into decisions that destroyed him before anyone else had the chance to judge him. Yet the cruel paradox is this: the more he fails, the more he wants to return to the battlefield. The more he needs to pull off one undeniable victory that forces Jill to see him differently. So when Kane steps in with the Chancellor offer, like a bridge straight to what Billy has been craving, Billy doesn't see it as just a career move. He sees a chance to rewrite himself, to win in a respectable way, to stand tall in front of Jill without feeling smaller. And then Jill's health crisis arrives like a blade cutting that dream in half. It places Billy in a position where he can't keep pretending. The world still follows the usual rules of power and ambition. When someone like Jill suddenly becomes vulnerable, life stops revolving around plans. It starts revolving around time, around breathing, around pain no one can negotiate with. That's exactly where the central question begins to burn. Could this crisis open the door for Jill and Billy to truly heal their relationship? Or will it only magnify regret, make it sharper, make it crueler because it arrives too late? Inside Billy, that question doesn't appear gently. It hits like a war inside his chest. One part of him is pulled toward Jill, toward responsibility, toward the fear of loss. The other part clings to Kane's proposal, to the momentum that feels like a lifeline. Outsiders might label Billy cold or selfish, but anyone who understands him can see something far more dangerous. Billy isn't numb, as panicking. And when Billy panics, he clutches onto a large goal so he doesn't have to stare directly at his deepest fear. The fear he can't control. He can fight in a boardroom. He can scheme. He can challenge Victor. He can confront Kane. But he can't negotiate with Jill's illness. He can't slow time down. He can't sign a contract that restores Jill to the invincible force he's always known. And Sally stands right in the center of that storm. If Jill is the person who can make Billy collapse internally, Sally becomes the person who makes him feel exposed from the outside. Billy's anger when he learns Sally tried to contact Jill about Kane's offer isn't just about interference, it's about territory. Billy is so used to other people managing him, judging him, steering him, Jack, Jill, Victor, anyone with enough power to claim ownership of his choices. Because of that history, Billy has developed a strange survival reflex. He can mess up his own life, but he can't tolerate someone else trying to fix it for him. In Billy's world, help often feels like control, and control feels like becoming the weaker version of himself again. Sally may believe she's protecting Billy, trying to keep him from stepping into Kane's trap when Jill is at her most fragile. But Billy absorbs it differently, in a way that's partly unfair and partly heartbreaking. He feels like Sally is using Jill as an emotional shield to block his path. He feels like she's dragging Jill's crisis into the conversation to soften him, confuse him, stop him from moving forward with his next steps alongside Kane. And the most painful part is that Billy isn't even sure whether he's right or wrong. Yet the suspicion alone is enough to poison him. Because when Billy doubts someone he loves, he isn't just afraid of betrayal. He's afraid of being foolish again, of being manipulated again, of handing his heart to someone who might unintentionally destroy everything. That internal conflict thickens the air around him. It turns every decision into something sharp. Billy looks at Sally and sees two images layered together: a woman who truly cares, and a woman he fears might want to control him. The more Sally tries to explain herself, the more Billy feels like he's being pressured to trust her. And being pressured to trust is the one thing Billy hates most, because it reminds him of how his entire life has been about proving he deserves trust in the first place. Billy doesn't want to be guided by pity. He doesn't want to be led by emotion. He wants the right to choose, even if the choice is reckless. That is Billy's version of freedom, but arrogant and deeply wounded. But then Jill's crisis becomes too real to ignore. The moment Jill's condition turns critical, Billy's suspicion about Sally starts to collide with brutal reality. If Jill truly stands on the edge of something irreversible, Billy no longer has the luxury of pride. Every minute becomes something he might carry as regret for the rest of his life. And that's exactly what makes Billy even more volatile. Because people like Billy don't know how to face the terror of too late. They often turn fear into anger because anger feels like control. They blame someone because blame feels like action. They start a different fight so they don't have to stare directly at the one battle they can't win. So could Jill's health crisis actually open the door to healing? It couldn't. That's precisely why it's so cruel. Because healing for Jill and Billy would never be a simple embrace or a few soft words. It wouldn't be the kind of reconciliation where everything is magically forgiven. For them, healing would be like emotional surgery. It would demand that both of them admit they have genuinely hurt each other. Jill would have to admit her harshness sometimes pushed Billy toward self-destruct. Billy would have to admit he used rebellion as revenge. And at times he wanted to defeat Jill more than he wanted to love her. Those truths are almost impossible to speak, especially when illness turns life into a countdown. There's also another painful reality one that feels heartbreakingly human. Sometimes people only heal when they no longer have the ability to avoid the truth. Jill becoming fragile could force her to see Billy differently, not through the eyes of control, but through the eyes of a mother who suddenly understands time isn't endless. And Billy, faced with the possibility of losing Jill, might finally realize he doesn't need a title to earn approval. He just needs a chance to avoid regret. The problem is that Billy isn't someone who transforms overnight. He doesn't change because tragedy arrives. He often fights tragedy with instinct, and instinct might drive him to push Sally away first. What makes everything even more tense is Kane's presence in the same moment Jill becomes vulnerable. Kane doesn't have to do anything obvious. He simply has to be there at the right time, positioned to witness Billy's panic. And the timing becomes suspicious on its own. Billy may begin to wonder if Kane is exploiting Jill's weakness to drag him deeper into a trap. Billy may start to question whether the Chancellor offer is a real opportunity or a perfectly wrapped snare. And once Billy starts to doubt Kane, it doesn't automatically bring him peace. It can push him toward Sally as a safe place or push him toward doubting Sally even more. Because Billy often swings between those extremes without finding a middle ground. Meanwhile, Sally is fighting her own quiet war. She doesn't want Billy to see her as an obstacle. She doesn't want to become Kane's opponent in Billy's eyes, because that would turn love into a power struggle. And Billy has never handled that kind of conflict well. But Sally also can't stand still and watch Billy march deeper into Kane's plan. While Jill is hanging on by a thread, there's a very real fear Sally may never say out loud if Billy keeps prioritizing ambition. One day he'll wake up and realize he chose the wrong thing first, and that realization will crush him. Sally doesn't want to witness Billy become darker and more bitter, simply because he didn't stop in time. That's why the conflict between Billy and Sally isn't just a relationship argument anymore. It becomes a collision between two different survival instincts. Billy needs control in order to feel alive. Sally needs protection in order to feel her love has meaning. And Jill, despite her weakness, becomes the gravitational center pulling them both into the spiral. Billy believes Sally is using Jill to block him. But the truth might be far more heartbreaking. Sally may be desperate to save Billy from Billy. And Billy, terrified of losing Jill, turns Sally into a target for his panic because if he admits the true thief, he admits Jill might truly be slipping away, then he has to admit he can't fix it. If I'm being honest, the saddest part of this isn't even the political tug-of-war over a title. It's the way people waste the most precious minutes misunderstanding each other. Jill and Billy may have already missed too many chances to say the right thing at the right time. And now, with time thinning like paper, they risk missing another chance because Billy doesn't know how to release his pride. And Jill may no longer have the strength to maintain her armor. Stories like this always leave me with a deeply personal kind of ache. Because they reflect something painfully true. People often realize what they need only when they are about to lose it. Not because they are cruel, but because they are busy surviving behind their defenses. Jill's health crisis might open a door to healing, but it won't open gently. It will open with cracks and panic and long silences. It will open with Billy standing alone, feeling the air go cold as if his entire life is slowing down. It will open with him looking at himself not as a man chasing power, but as a son afraid of losing his mother. And in that moment, Billy won't be able to keep pretending Sally is simply interfering. He'll have to face the possibility that Sally is the only person brave enough to pull him out of a power-fueled trance before he falls into another abyss. But if healing happens, it will come with a price. Billy will have to choose. He can't keep Jill as a symbol to prove himself, keep Kane as a shortcut to victory, and keep Sally as a shelter for his fear all at once. Sooner or later, Billy will have to decide who he wants to be. A man who chases victory to escape pain, or a man who walks into pain to protect what truly matters. And if Billy chooses wrong, the damage won't just ruin a plan. It will carve a permanent wound into his heart. When I reach the end of this moment in the story, I'm left with a strange mixture of tension and sadness and a fragile hope I'm not even sure deserves to exist. Because I understand Billy in a way that feels almost too real. Sometimes people lash out not because they hate, but because they are terrified. And I understand Sally too. Sometimes people interfere not because they want to control, but because they can't bear the idea of watching someone they love drift deeper into darkness. If Jill is truly on the edge of something irreversible, then this might be the moment Billy is forced to grow up in the most painful way possible. And I can't help feeling on a very personal, human level that I want him to choose the path that leaves the least regret behind when it's all over. Because there are some battles you don't need to win against anyone. You only need to win against the moment that tells you it's already too late. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.